Okay, hello. My name is Evan Sinisak. I am recording this demo video for the Info 6017 Artificial Intelligence Project 1. I have some music playing in the background just as some background noise. Please let me know if it's too loud, and for future I'll either have it turned down or not playing. So for this project, we had to make a simple first-person shooter arena kind of thing that would demonstrate the different steering behaviors of seek, flee, pursue, evade, approach, wander, and idle. Each enemy type must be a different model. I didn't really do that, did I? Anyways. Oops. I'm gonna just go through this, show off each part of the rubric, and as I do, I'll explain the code behind it, and then I'll show how the gameplay part works. And everything froze. I'll be right back. Alright, that was interesting. Media player and Microsoft Word froze. Everything seems to be good now. Gonna keep Task Manager open on the other screen just to keep an eye on things. But yeah, so I'm gonna go through each part of the rubric and explain how I implemented it, and explain the code behind it. So the first part is the player. Player controls an entity that can turn and move forward and backwards, and the player is able to fire a primary weapon with the press of a key. So I basically decided to recreate the FPS player from the asynchronous lectures. I just kind of stole the prefab from that and put it into this project, and then implemented everything else in either the same or a very similar manner. So the main camera of the scene is attached to the player and has the mouse movement script, which has its public variables for the mouse sensitivity, the player transform, and the X rotation. I'll explain the mask and the hit stuff when I get to the enemy type A, but at the start of the game, or at the start of the scene, when the script gets called, it locks the state of the cursor, and then during update, we update the X and Y movement with the input mouse X, mouse Y, and lock the rotation so that you can't just look straight above or straight below you and move beyond it. So in practice, if I hit play on Unity, I also implemented the UI, so I have a score, and I just decided to add a high score that keeps track of the highest. So I can use WASD, move the player around. I still have the space jump. Did I implement the reset? I did. Okay, good. So yeah, WASD to move. Mouse left click fires a paintball shot. And so yeah, player movement. We have a speed variable, gravity, jump height, starting position, need to respawn. Again, basically what we had for the asynchronous lecture portion. Get the horizontal and vertical input, which is by default WASD or the arrow keys, and then move right and forward times the X and Z input, and as long as it's grounded, the velocity of the Y is 0, and then when you press jump or space, we apply this jump to the y velocity, and then otherwise we add the gravity and move the whole thing by the velocity times time. If the position gets less than a certain y value, we respawn, and if respawn is true, we reset to the start position, and that's it. I'll explain that when I get to the gameplay part. So the first enemy type A seeks the player position if the player is facing away from the enemy and flees from the player if the player is facing towards this enemy. I thought of a couple ways of doing this, but the method that I settled on is when I think it's in the camera. So every frame, the camera sends out a raycast from its position forward, and if sorry about that, I got a text. So every frame, the camera sends out a raycast, and if the object that it hits has the tag enemy type A, then we tell the script on it to set its seeking variable to false. So the way I decided to handle my enemies is similar to how in the asynchronous courses we had a base steering behavior script. I decided to make a base enemy script that has all the information that every enemy is going to have. So every enemy type is going to have a target, its weight, mass, max speed, max force, max turn speed, starting rotation was something we started adding for the actual animated model towards the week 4 lecture. Its rigid body and its materials, a list of its materials to change depending on which type it's on or which seeking behavior it is performing. In the start, it gets its rigid body component, and if it doesn't have a rigid body, it adds one. And then during update, it calculates the steering force, applies the steer, and rotates the object to look where it's going. And on the base, this calculates steering force, just returns a vector 0, and then each enemy type will override this function. Apply steer takes the vector 3 and multiplies it by the time and weight, and then compares the magnitude of the velocity to the max speed, and if it's greater than the max speed, then we normalize it and set it to the max speed by multiplying by it. Look where you're going, gets the direction from the velocity, and then normalizes it. Get the square magnitude, and then does the rotation math to change the transform rotation to rotate around the y-axis, to rotate around its y-axis to face the direction that it's going. We also have the public set target function that takes in a transform and sets the target to this new target. And on collision enter, if the enemy collides with the paintball fired by the player, then we reduce the enemy count and add a point to the score and destroy the game object. So enemy type A uses seek and flee. So for this enemy type, we're not using the approach behavior, but I still have the arrive and target radius. I decided to make a public boolean called seeking that starts as true, and it has a transform for the player transform, which will be the target for the seek and flee behavior. So at the start, it finds the player game object and sets its transform to the target, and then during calculate steering force, if we're seeking, we set the material to the first material, and then we return the seek vector 3. Otherwise we set the material to the second material, set seeking to true, and return the flee vector 3. And I'll explain why I do this in a second. So seek, I just transplanted this from I basically transplanted all the steering behaviors from the async, or from our lectures, and implemented them for this project. So seek calculates the direction using the target position and the current position, and then just steers towards it. And flee does the opposite. It figures out the direction from the current position minus the target position, and then figures out the desired velocity and steers the object towards it. So as I mentioned, the mouse, every frame is sending out a raycast, and if it hits an enemy of type A, we set the seeking variable to false. So on the same token, the enemy type A is setting the seeking variable to true every frame, but if it's getting set to false by the ray, it overwrites it and continues to do the flee function. So I've enabled my enemy type A prefab object in the scene. As you can see, I decided that for the seek behavior, it will be the sky blue material, and when it's in the flee behavior, it is the orange material. I've decided that the raycast was going to be easier to implement and more efficient than trying to figure out whether... Well, I figured the other options were either send out a bunch of raycasts in a radius around from the direction that the player is facing, or have to calculate the position and rotation of the player object in world space, compare it to the position of the enemy, and from there set whether it's fleeing or seeking. So this method is a little bit too precise because obviously I'm looking towards the enemy, but it's not fleeing. But if I place the enemy in the center of the screen so the raycast is getting hit, now it's suddenly fleeing and its material changes. And as long as the raycast is hitting it, it continues keeping the flee behavior, and as soon as the raycast is no longer hitting it, it begins the seek behavior again. And if I shoot it, where is my mouse? And if I shoot it, it gets destroyed, and the score and high score increase. So that's all for enemy type A. Enemy type B pursues the player and evades the closest bullet fired by the player. So for enemy type B, again, inherits from the enemy. I decided to have a evade distance. So I have some variables: evade distance, which is by default set to 10, a closest distance variable, and the transform evade target, and the public float t maximum steps for pursue and evade, and of course we need our player transform. So at the start, get the player transform, set that as the target for pursue. Now in calculate steering force. First thing we do is set the closest distance to some massive number. Then we do a for each game object paintball in the game world, we find the objects with the tag paintball, and we set this local variable distance, or dist, to the magnitude of the paintball position compared to the enemy position. And if the distance is less than the closest distance, then we set the evade target to that paintball's transform, and we set the closest distance to distance. Then, after going through all the game objects, we check if the closest distance is less than the evade distance. If it is, then we set the material to the second material, we set the target to the evade target, which will be the paintball, and then we return evade. Otherwise, we do the pursue behavior, which sets the material to the first material and sets the target back to the player transform. And we return pursue, which pursue is very similar to this team maximum time step should be more than 1. Let's just set that to 10 by default. I think. Anyways. Pursue, again, this is just from what we did in class. Figure out what the future position of the object is, and then pursue towards that future position. And evade does the same thing, but runs away from it. So what that means is if I am standing still, then this enemy should kind of pursue towards my last known, or like what my future position is. And it's a little bit off. It's kind of trying, I think it needs to be faster, but also don't want it to be too much faster. And as you can see, every time I fire a bullet, it changes color and it starts trying to run away from them. And let's say I fire a bullet way over here. Some of them are actually still close enough that it's evading them, but otherwise it continues to pursue the player until I shoot it. Enemy type C. Enemy type C approaches the player and maintains a radius, and then if in the specified range, it faces the player and fires a projectile. So enemy type C just uses the seek behavior, but unlike on enemy type A, we actually set the arrive and target radius, which I should actually, what did I do? 8 and 5? Just so that they're always set by default. And similar to how I fire an object, or the projectiles from the player, gonna need to be able to fire a projectile from the enemy at the player. So I just decided to do it exactly the same way as we do it on the player. Start, get and set the information we need. Calculate steering force. We increase the fire time and we return the seek. And the only difference is if, where is it? Oh, here. I'm staring at it. If our distance is less than the target radius, we're going to stop moving and set the velocity to 0. And we're going to run the fire projectile in the direction that we are facing the player, since Seek is still trying to approach the player directly. If we're not in the stopping radius, then we set the material to the first material, and we apply the approach behavior, and we slow down the velocity using this math. God, I'm so out of it. I'm so sorry. So the fire projectile function takes in the vector 3 direction, and just to make sure, I'm running look at direction at that direction, set the material to the second material, and then check if we can fire, because we don't want to be firing too often. If the fire time is greater than the rate of fire, then we are allowed to fire a projectile, instantiate it, and set its velocity in the direction of the player. So in practice, also enemy type B, its pursue color is light green and its evade color is purple. Enemy type C, when it is seeking the player, it has the silver color, and when it is within range and going to fire at the player, it turns gold. I also made a copy of the paintball prefab called Bad Paintball. Really the only change is that it still has the paintball script, but it has the tag enemy, so that if it hits the player, it counts as the player getting hit by a player, and it resets the game. And I changed the material to black instead of red. So if I run the game, so it seeks the player and then turns gold and has a 2-second fire time. And if I just stay within range, and those are not going towards me anymore, that's not good. And now it is, and that's not what I wanted to happen. So why is that? Okay. I may need to make that distance a bit bigger because I keep getting hit by them. Is it? Why are you firing over there? I don't remember it doing that. Instantiate the paintball at the spawn point position and then set the velocity to direction. Which direction is the target position minus the transform position? Target position should be the player transform. Target is FPS player. I love it when things go wrong. Okay, where's the... Oh, is it on paintball gun? Fire paintball. Send it array. Destination. minus the spawn point position. Our destination is the destination, which makes sense. So direction is the target position minus the transform position. What if? What if I try that? I don't remember it doing that, but what if I try this? There we go. Okay. I could have sworn it was doing this before, the other way. But yeah, anyways, it seeks the player, does not fire bullets until it is within range, and then if its fire time is correct, and as I spin around it very, very fast, it continues rotating and looking at me. Alright. Didn't realize it was doing that. That was a change in the script, so that should change the prefabs as well. Enemy type D. This is taking longer than I wanted it to. Wanders around for 6 seconds using the method covered in class, and then switches to idle, where it then idles for 3 seconds before returning to wander. So the way I decided to handle that is I have a have the Boolean wandering set to true, I'm treating it like a flag. A wander timer, which just keeps track of how long we want to wander for. The idle timer, which is just how long we want to idle for. And the timer, and then the distance, the circle, and circle radius for the wander behavior. So in calculate steering force, we add delta time to our timer, and then we check if we're wandering, make sure the material is the first material. If the timer is greater than the wandering timer, then reset the timer, set wandering to false, and return the wander vector 3. Otherwise, set the material to the second material, check if the timer is greater than the idle timer, set to 0 if it is, and then set wandering to true so that we switch behavior. Otherwise, return idle, which idle is just set the velocity to 0 and sit there. And wander just gets this circle point from the current position and our distance to circle variable, figures out the angle and circle radius from all this stuff, figure out what the target position is, and just for debugging and seeing what's actually happening, I kept the draw line. So enemy type D has a dark purple material for while it's wandering, and then it turns red when it idles. And this one we can just kind of watch as it just kind of wanders over there, turns red, idles for 3 seconds, and then wanders again for 6 seconds. And of course, shooting it treats it like every other enemy. Okay. D. So the way I decided to set up the gameplay part of this is similar to how we started, to what we started doing. I decided to make 8 different spawn points all around the arena. And then I have the enemy spawn controller script, which has the 4 different prefabs for each enemy type. and the 8 different spawn point transforms. And I decided maximum enemies could be 20. Enough to overwhelm the player, but be manageable. So at the start, we set the enemy count to 0. During update, we increase rubric. So gameplay: if the player collides with the enemy or an enemy bullet, then the enemy is destroyed and the player respawns in the center of the arena. I decided to do what we did in class, and instead of just destroy the enemy that hit us, I clear the whole stage and reset the score. Although both are pretty easy to implement. I decided that enemies will just be shot once. I've done health variables on enemies in previous stuff. It's really not that complicated. You just give it a float, and then when you hit it, you decrease, or even an int, and then when you hit it, you just decrease that health. So I just decided to do the once and destroy it. And enemies spawn randomly in waves of at least 6 or continuously at a set interval. I decided to do the continuously at the set interval, but just with a 20 maximum so that we don't just blow up the computer with an infinite number of enemies. So in update, we continually increase the spawn timer, and as long as our current enemy count is less than the maximum number of enemies, we pick one of the spawn locations between 0 and the length. Set the enemy type between 0 and the enemy prefab's length, and then instantiate the enemy prefab with the enemy type at the randomly chosen spawn location position with the identity quaternion, reset the spawn timer, increase enemy count, and then just remove all enemies, and score reset is all stuff we did in class. So now that I've re-enabled the spawn points, if I start the game, there is an enemy type C, and a type A, and a type D already spawning. So type C is the one that shoots at us. Oops, okay, my position did not get reset because I clicked out, but all the enemies got destroyed. So I can go around, start shooting some of the enemies. If I move too fast, you actually run into your own bullet and destroy it, which is fun. So now I've got my score of 7 and my high score of 7, so I'm just going to run into... And now... Anybody? Any of you? I don't know why, but the rigid body collisions are kind of buggy. And that time it reset everything perfectly, so I don't know what's going on with it. But more or less, it basically just on the collision, and again, now it worked perfectly. On the collision, it resets everything, destroys all the enemies. I must not be calling the reset position. And then sometimes you can just sit on top of an enemy. Are they not? I have a feeling the tags aren't getting set properly. Tag enemy, tag enemy type A. And the bad paintball has the tag enemy. How do I call respawn or reset? call it here, but player movement. If collision game object tag is enemy or enemy type A, need to respawn is true. Transform position is equal to starting position. Starting position is equal to its starting position. Yeah, I don't know. It's just a little buggy for some reason. I do. No, that's not. No. Is it the is kinematic? Is it gonna fall over if I turn that off? Yep. Yeah, it's falling over. So it needs to be is kinematic. Kinematic body only supports speculative continuous. Well, let's just try it, see if it's more consistent. Come here. I need to run into you. I ran into it, it destroyed everything, but it did not reset the position. It's no more consistent. Yeah, I don't know. So yeah, I'm going to write the README and submit this. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day. Bye.